The radiator in the hallway gave a final, wheezing metallic groan before falling silent, leaving the small apartment in a state of heavy, cold stillness. Arthur sat at the small kitchen table, his fingers thick and calloused from 40 years at the steel mill, tracing the wood grain of the tabletop. Across from him, Beatrice was nursing a lukewarm cup of tea, her eyes fixed on the classified section of the local gazette. "It's not just the cold, Artie," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle rasp of a woman who had spent a lifetime choir singing and storytelling. "It's the walls. I feel like they're leaning in a little more every year." Arthur nodded slowly. They had lived in this 3-room walk-up since 1982. They had raised 2 children here. But now, with the pension checks barely covering the rising rent and the neighborhood transforming into a maze of glass-fronted condos they couldn't afford to walk past, the city felt like it was trying to shake them off. "I saw the notice for the county auction," Arthur mentioned, his voice low. He reached into his flannel shirt pocket and pulled out a clipped piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. "The Thorn Place, out in the valley." Beatrice looked up, a flicker of something memory, or perhaps a spark of defiance crossing her face. "The Thorn Place. Artie, that house has been a ghost for 50 years. People say the ground there is sour." "People say a lot when they're afraid of a little hard work," Arthur countered gently. "The county seized it for back taxes. Nobody wants it, because the title is a mess and the roof is half gone. But the bones be..." "I walked the perimeter last Sunday. Those stones were laid by hand. They don't build like that anymore." The journey to the auction house the following Tuesday felt like a dream. The room was filled with young men in sharp suits, developers with tablets and blueprints looking for fix-and-flip opportunities. Arthur and Beatrice sat in the back row, their Sunday best, smelling faintly of cedar and mothballs. When the Thorn estate came up, the room went quiet. The auctioneer cleared his throat, his voice echoing off the linoleum floors. "Parcel 402, the Thorn property. Sold as ease. Structural damage reported. Potential environmental hazards. Bidding starts at 5,000. Silence stretched. One developer whispered to another about the cost of demolition. Another checked his watch. No one raised a hand. To the professionals in the room, the house was a liability, a black hole for capital. Arthur felt Beatrice's hand slide into his. Her grip was firm. He raised his hand. 5,000, Arthur said, his voice surprisingly steady. The auctioneer looked surprised. He scanned the room for a counteroffer. 5,000 twice. The hammer fell with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Sold to the gentleman in the back. The drive out to the valley was silent. The old sedan hummed as the concrete of the city gave way to the skeletal gray trees of late autumn. When they finally turned onto the long, overgrown driveway of the Thorn estate, the house didn't appear all at once. It revealed itself in pieces, a sagging porch, a turret that pierced the fog like a broken finger, and windows that looked like hollow eyes. It was a Victorian monster, draped in ivy that looked like strangling hands. The paint had long ago turned to gray flakes that littered the overgrown grass. "Oh, Artie," Beatrice whispered, stepping out of the car. The air was different, here thicker, smelling of damp earth and ancient wood. Arthur walked to the front door. He didn't use the key yet. He placed his palm against the heavy oak wood. He expected to feel a chill, but instead, there was a strange, faint vibration as if the house were taking its first breath in half a century. The lock was stubborn, rusted by decades of rain. But with a firm shove from Arthur's shoulder, the door gave way. A cloud of dust, shimmering like powdered silver in the thin afternoon light, swirled around them. The interior was a graveyard of the Gilded Age. Velvet curtains hung in tatters, looking like the wings of giant bats. A grand staircase wound its way up into the darkness of the second floor, the banister coated in a layer of grime so thick it looked like fur. "We're too old for this," Beatrice said, though she was already walking toward the parlor, her fingers reaching out to touch a marble fireplace mantel. "Maybe," Arthur said, following her. Or maybe this is the only thing big enough to hold us. They spent the first few hours just breathing it in. It wasn't just a house. It was a capsule. In the kitchen, a calendar from 1968 still hung on the wall, the edges curled. A heavy iron stove sat in the corner, cold and imposing, but as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the floorboards, the feel of the house changed. It didn't feel empty. It felt crowded. Not with ghosts, necessarily, but with the weight of things left unsaid. Arthur decided to check the cellar stairs to ensure that the foundation was solid before they brought in their first load of supplies. And headed toward the back of the house. The cellar door was tucked behind the pantry. It didn't moan when it opened. It swung silently, as if someone had recently oiled the hinges. Arthur frowned. He shone the light down the stone steps. "Stay up here," he called out. "I'm right behind you." "Arthur Vance, don't think you're going into the dark alone," she replied, her footsteps echoing his. The cellar was massive, divided into several rooms with low-arched ceilings. The air was colder here, tasting of copper. As Arthur panned the light across the walls, he noticed something odd. The stones in the far corner didn't match the rest of the foundation. They were newer, or perhaps just cleaner. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on something. He looked down. The floor was littered with small white objects. He knelt, picking one up. It wasn't a stone. It was a button. A small, pearl button from a child's coat. He looked at the mismatched wall again. There was a faint gap in the masonry, a hairline fracture that formed the shape of a small rectangular door. "Arthur, look at this," Beatrice said from the other side of the room. She was pointing the light at a stack of old wooden crates. But they weren't crates. They were suitcases. Dozens of them. Leather valises, cardboard trunks, and vanity cases, all stacked neatly, covered in a heavy canvas tarp. Arthur walked over and pulled the tarp back. The dust choked him for a second. These weren't the belongings of the Thorne family. He recognized the names embossed on the leather tags. They were names from the old neighborhood, names of families who had supposedly moved away during the redevelopment decades ago. "Why is there luggage in the Thorne cellar?" Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling. Arthur didn't answer. He turned his light back to the hidden door in the wall. He reached out, his fingers finding a recessed latch hidden behind a loose stone. With a heavy, grinding sound, the panel swung inward. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness of the hidden chamber. It wasn't a storage room. It looked like an office's secret, windowless room filled with filing cabinets and a heavy iron safe. On top of the safe sat a leather-bound ledger. Arthur opened the ledger to the first page. It wasn't a record of taxes or property. It was a list. Next to several names, there was a single, chilling word written in red ink: liquidated, suddenly. The heavy front door upstairs slammed shut with a force that shook the floorboards above their heads. The sound of heavy footsteps, not the light step of a ghost, but the rhythmic, disciplined thud of leather boots echoed through the house. "Arthur," Beatrice breathed. Gripping his arm, blue and red lights began to pulse against the grime-streaked cellar windows high above. The police weren't just passing by. They were here. And as the sirens wailed closer, Arthur realized that the almost nothing they had paid for the house might have been a very different kind of price. The sirens outside did not stop. They stayed loud and steady, their blue and red lights cutting through the thick dust of the cellar windows like rhythmic heartbeats. Arthur and Beatrice stood frozen in the hidden room, the heavy leather ledger still open in Arthur's hands. The air down there felt like it had been trapped for 50 years, thick with the smell of old paper and something metallic. Upstairs, the floorboards groaned. It wasn't the wind. The darkness swallowed them whole, leaving only the pulsing neon light from the high windows to show the outlines of the stacked suitcases. He felt Beatrice's hand find his sleeve. But her grip was like iron. They had spent 40 years being invisible in the city. The kind of people who kept their heads down and worked hard. "Author Beatrice," whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Why are they here?" "I don't know, B," he whispered back. "But those suitcases, those names, those people didn't just move away. They were robbed." The cellar door at the top of the stairs creaked open. A beam of light, much stronger than Arthur's, sliced through the dark. It swept across the stone walls, catching the glint of the pearl button Arthur had dropped on the floor. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance?" a voice called out. It wasn't the aggressive shout of a raid. It was calm, professional, and strangely expectant. "This is Sergeant Miller. We saw your car out front. We need you to come upstairs. Now." Arthur looked at the ledger. He knew instinctively that if he left it on the safe, it might disappear forever. He tucked the heavy book under his arm, sliding it beneath his oversized flannel shirt. He patted Beatrice's hand, a silent signal to be brave, and they began the slow climb up the wooden stairs. Each step felt like a mile. Each creak of the wood felt like a warning. When they reached the kitchen, the sight was jarring. For officers were in the house. They weren't searching the cupboards or looking for intruders. They were standing around the perimeter of the room as if they were guarding it. Sergeant Miller was a man in his late 50s, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of a very tired piece of oak. He didn't look at the Vances with suspicion, but with a profound, weary sadness. "You bought this place at the county auction, didn't you?" Miller asked. He didn't wait for an answer. He looked around the kitchen, his eyes lingering on the peeling wallpaper. "You got it for a song?" "Almost nothing." "Did you ever ask yourselves why the town let a house this big sit and rot for half a century?" "We thought people were just afraid of the work," Arthur said, his voice regaining its strength. He didn't mention the ledger tucked against his ribs. "We wanted a home, Sergeant. A real one. Is there a problem with the deed?" Miller stepped closer, his boots heavy on the linoleum. "The deed is legal. But this house? It has a memory. And the people who used to run this town had a way of making sure that memory stayed buried. We got a call from an anonymous tip line 10 minutes ago. Someone said they saw trespassers entering the Thorne estate. But I think someone was just worried you'd start digging." Beatrice stepped forward, her chin tilted up. "We weren't digging. We were cleaning. And we found things, Sergeant. Trunks, suitcases, things that belonged to families from our old neighborhood. Families who lost everything in the 50s. The room went very quiet. One of the younger officers shifted his feet, his holster leather squeaking. Miller sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked at the other officers and gave a sharp nod. "Clear the perimeter. Secure the gates. Nobody comes in or out of this driveway without my word." Once the younger men moved outside, Miller turned back to the Vances. He looked at Arthur's bulky shirt but didn't ask him to empty it. "My grandfather was on the force back then," Miller said quietly. "He used to talk about the Thorne family. They didn't just own the bank and the land. They owned the people. If they wanted a block of houses for a new development, those houses became theirs. People who complained disappeared. People who fought back found themselves in debt they couldn't explain. We always knew the records were hidden somewhere. We just didn't know the house would ever be sold to someone who actually cared to look." Arthur took a deep breath. He pulled the ledger out from under his shirt and set it on the kitchen table. The clack of the leather hitting the wood sounded like a gavel. "It's all in here," Arthur said. "The names. The liquidations. This house wasn't a home. It was a vault for everything they stole from our people." Beatrice walked over to the window, watching the police tape being stretched across their front gate. "What happens now?" she asked. "Is this still our home? Or did we just buy a grave?" Miller looked at the ledger, his hand hovering over the cover but not touching it. "Technically, you own the property and everything inside it. But this ledger, this is evidence of a 50-year-old conspiracy. There are families in this town, powerful families who still live on the money recorded in those pages. They aren't going to be happy that a couple from the city holds the keys to their ruin." "You aren't looking for a fight," Arthur said firmly. "We just wanted a garden and a porch where the air didn't taste like exhaust fumes. "I know," Miller said, "but you found the truth instead. And in this town, the truth is more expensive than the house." As the night deepened, the police set up a small command post in the driveway. They told the Vances it was for their protection, but Arthur felt the weight of the situation. He and Beatrice sat in the parlor, the only room with a working light bulb they had brought with them. They didn't sleep. They sat on 2 folding chairs they had brought in their car, surrounded by the shadows of a history that was no longer hidden. Around 3 a.m., there was a faint tap on the window pane. It wasn't the police. Arthur stood up, signaling for Beatrice to stay back. He moved to the window and wiped away a circle of grime. Outside, standing just beyond the reach of the police floodlights, was an elderly woman. She was wrapped in a thick wool coat, holding a faded photograph against her chest. Arthur opened the window just a crack. The cold night air rushed in. "Can I help you, ma'am?" The woman looked up, her eyes bright with tears. "My father's name was on a suitcase," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw it on the news ticker. They said the Vances found the thorn hoard. My father went to that house in 1959 to argue about his shop's lease. He never came home. They said he ran away. They said he took the money and left us." She held up the photo. It was a young man in a baker's apron, smiling. "If his suitcase is in that cellar, it means he didn't leave us. It means he was kept from us." Arthur looked back at Beatrice. He saw the same realization in her eyes. This wasn't just about a mansion or a bargain. This was about returning the souls of a community to their rightful place. "Wait there," Arthur told the woman. He turned to Miller, who was walking back into the house. "Sergeant, we aren't waiting for the morning. We're going back down. We're going to find that man's name." The rest of the night was a blur of dust and discovery. With the police providing light and security, Arthur and Beatrice began the task of cataloging the suitcases. It was a somber, holy work. They found jewelry boxes, wedding albums, property deeds, and even children's toys all stashed away like trophies. Each item was a piece of a life that had been interrupted. But as they moved a heavy wardrobe in the back of the hidden room, they found something that changed the nature of the investigation entirely. Behind the wardrobe was a small, iron-bound door that led even deeper into the hillside. "Arthur, stop," Miller cautioned, his hand on his holster. Arthur ignored him. He pushed the door open. Inside wasn't more stolen goods. It was a small, clean room with a single desk and a telephone that looked like it belonged in a museum. On the desk was a more recent ledger, this one from the late 90s. Arthur flipped it open. The names were different now. They weren't just names of the missing. They were names of current city council members, judges, and developers. Beside the names were monthly payments labeled maintenance. Beatrice asked, leaning over his shoulder. Arthur looked at the wall. Connected to cameras hidden throughout the town's current municipal buildings. The Thorn estate hadn't been abandoned. It had been used as a blackmail hub for decades, a place where the old guard kept tabs on the new. They weren't just hiding the past, Arthur said, his voice cold. They were using it to run the present. Just as the realization hit them, the power to the house was cut. The cellar plunged into total blackness. Outside, the sound of the police sirens changed. They weren't pulsing anymore. They were moving away, Miller. Arthur called out. There was no answer. The silence of the house returned, but this time it was predatory. The Vances were alone in the dark, standing on top of a mountain of secrets. And they could hear the front door of the mansion creaking open once again. This time, the footsteps didn't belong to the police. Arthur gripped the ledger to his chest and reached for Beatrice's hand. Don't let go, he whispered. Whatever happens, don't let go. The darkness in the cellar was thick, like a heavy blanket that pressed against Arthur's chest. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe. He stood there with his arm pulled tight around Beatrice, feeling the frantic, quick rhythm of her heart against his ribs. The silence of the mansion was gone, replaced by the slow, rhythmic thump drag of someone moving across the kitchen floor directly above their heads. It wasn't the confident stride of the police. It was the sound of someone who knew exactly where the floorboards were weak and where they would groan. Arthur's mind raced. He thought about the small pearl button in his pocket and the leather-bound book tucked under his arm. He realized that this house hadn't been a bargain. It had been a trap set 50 years ago, and he had walked right into it with a smile on his face and a dream of a garden. But he wasn't a young man anymore, and he didn't have the strength to fight a war. All he had was his wife and a truth that was too heavy to carry. "Arthur," Beatrice whispered, her voice so low it was almost a vibration. "The lights. The police are gone." He squeezed her hand. Knew. The sirens had faded into the distance, leaving only the wind howling through the broken eaves of the roof. With a flick of his thumb, a tiny flame danced between them. In the orange glow, Beatrice's face looked pale, her eyes wide and reflecting the fire. She looked like the girl he had met at the church social 45 years ago, scared but determined. "We have to get out of the cellar," Arthur said. "But not the way we came in. If they're in the kitchen, we're cornered." He turned the flame toward the back of the hidden room, toward the iron-bound door he had found earlier. The room with the monitors and the modern ledgers felt like a den of snakes. He didn't want to go back in there, but it was the only way that led deeper into the foundation. They stepped over the stacks of stolen suitcases, their boots making soft clicking sounds on the stone. Arthur felt a pang of guilt leaving the belongings of those missing families behind in the dark. But he knew he couldn't help them if he was buried alongside them. They entered the small, windowless office. The monitors were dead screens now, reflecting the tiny flame of Arthur's lighter. He scanned the walls. In his experience as a mill worker, he knew that a room built into a hillside always had to have a secondary vent or an escape hatch for air. He ran his hand along the cold, damp stone. Sharp whistle of cold air, he moved a heavy metal filing cabinet. The screech of metal on stone, sounding like a scream in the quiet house. Behind it was a narrow wooden door, no taller than a child. It was swollen with moisture and locked from the outside with a simple iron bolt. "Help me be," he grunted. Together, they pulled. The wood groaned and splintered. With a final violent snap, the bolt gave way and the door swung open. A rush of freezing night air hit them, smelling of wet leaves and freedom. They scrambled through the opening, emerging into a dense thicket of briars behind the mansion. The house loomed above them, a black silhouette against the gray sky. They didn't run to the car. Arthur knew the driveway would be watched. Instead, they pushed through the thorns, the sharp branches tearing at his flannel shirt and Beatrice's coat. They moved toward the old stone wall that marked the edge of the property. Just as they reached the perimeter, a pair of headlights cut through the trees. A black sedan was idling at the gate. No police markings. Just a quiet, expensive engine humming in the dark. "They're waiting for us to leave," Beatrice whispered. "Oh," Arthur corrected. "They're waiting for someone to finish what they started inside." They huddled behind the stone wall, the cold seeping into their bones. Arthur looked at the house. He saw a flash of light in the second-story window, a flashlight beam. It was moving systematically, room by room. They didn't care about the elderly couple. They cared about the names written in red ink. "We need to get to the main road," Arthur said. "We need to find someone who isn't on that list." They walked for what felt like hours through the woods, following the sound of the distant highway. Every time a branch snapped or an owl hooted, they jumped. Finally, they reached a small gas station on the edge of the valley. It was a lonely place, lit by buzzing fluorescent lights that made the world look sickly and blue. Inside, a young man with messy hair was sitting behind the counter, reading a comic book. He looked up when the bell chimed, his eyes widening at the sight of the two disheveled seniors covered in cobwebs and scratches. "You guys okay?" the kid asked, standing up. "You look like you fell off a mountain. Call the state police," Arthur said, leaning heavily against the counter. "Not the local precinct. The state troopers. Tell them Arthur Vance is holding the Thorn ledger." The kid didn't move. He looked confused. "The Thorn place. My grandpa says that house is cursed. Curse is over, Beatrice said, her voice snapping with a sudden, fierce authority. Make the call, son. Now. While they waited, Arthur sat on a plastic crate in the back of the store. He opened the ledger again. He began to read the names out loud. These weren't just names to him anymore. He realized he recognized one Ezekiel Robinson. Ah, B. Arthur gasped. Look at this date. That was your uncle's friend. The one who they said stole the church funds and ran to Chicago. Beatrice leaned in, her eyes scanning the neat, cold handwriting. Next to Ezekiel's name was the word liquidated, and a dollar amount that matched the church's missing building fund to the penny. The blood drained from her face. They didn't just steal the money, she whispered. They framed him. They destroyed his name so they could keep the cash. He died in a shelter 10 years later, still trying to tell people he was innocent. Nobody believed him. The weight of the book felt like 1,000 pounds in Arthur's lap. It wasn't just a record of theft. It was a record of character assassination. It was a map of how a small group of men had dismantled the lives of everyone who stood in their way. Suddenly, a car pulled into the gas station lot. It wasn't a state trooper. 2 men stepped out. They weren't wearing masks, and they weren't carrying guns. They were wearing expensive wool overcoats and looked like they belonged in a boardroom. One of them, a man with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, walked into the store. He ignored the clerk and walked straight toward the back. Mr. Vance, the man said, his voice smooth and comforting. My name is Silas Thorne. I believe you have something that belongs to my family's estate. I'm here to clear up this unfortunate misunderstanding. Arthur stood up, his hand closing tight around the ledger. The only thing that belongs to your family is a long sentence in a small cell. Mr. Thorne. The man chuckled, a dry sound that made the hair on Arthur's neck stand up. You're tired, Arthur. You're cold. You've had a very long night. Why don't you hand over that old book? I can make sure your retirement is very, very comfortable. You could move back to the city. A penthouse. No more radiators that groan in the night. No more cold coffee. Beatrice stood beside Arthur, her hand on his shoulder. We like our cold coffee just fine, Mr. Thorne. It keeps us awake, and we've been asleep for too long. Silas Thorne's smile faded. The air in the gas station turned cold. You think you're being heroes? But look at you. You're 2 people who the world has already forgotten. If you disappear tonight, the news will say you got lost in the woods of your new home. A tragedy. An accident. He took a step forward. Arthur backed away, hitting the shelves of soda bottles. Stay back, the young clerk shouted from the counter. He was holding a heavy metal flashlight, his hand shaking. I called the troopers. They're 5 minutes out. Silas Thorne looked at the kid with utter contempt. He reached into his coat, but he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a cell phone. Cancel the call, son. Or your father's trucking license gets revoked by the morning. You know how this town works? The kid froze. He looked at Arthur, his eyes filled with an apology that broke Arthur's heart. This was the power of the Thorne family, not bullets, but the quiet, systematic destruction of a person's livelihood. Arthur looked at Beatrice. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the memory of Uncle Ezekiel. He looked at the ledger. You can take the book, Arthur said suddenly. Beatrice gasped. Arthur, no. Silas Thorne smiled again, holding out his hand. A wise choice, Mr. Vance. Arthur stepped forward, holding the ledger out. But as Thorne reached for it, Arthur didn't hand it over. He turned and threw the book with all his might into the large, industrial deep fryer behind the snack counter, where the clerk had been making late-night donuts. The heavy leather hit the boiling oil with a violent splash. Thick, acrid smoke began to billow out immediately. No, Thorne screamed, lunging toward the fryer, but it was too late. The old paper and the dry leather acted like kindling. Flames erupted from the vat, blackening the pages instantly. The evidence was being consumed, but so was Thorne's leverage. You fool. Thorne hissed, turning on Arthur. That was your only protection. Now you have nothing. I have my voice, Arthur said, his voice echoing through the smoky store. And I have the names. I spent 40 years memorizing steel specifications, Mr. Thorne. I have a very good memory. Ezekiel Robinson, the Miller family, the Hendersons. I'm going to say those names to every reporter in the state. Just then, the sound of real sirens filled the air, hyped, fast, and coming from the highway. Not one or two, but a dozen. For the first time, he looked small. He turned and ran for his car, but the gas station was already being surrounded by white and blue cruisers. Arthur and Beatrice walked out into the cold night air. The smoke from the fryer followed them, smelling of burnt history. Arthur felt a strange lightness in his chest. The physical book was gone, but the secret was out. A tall trooper with a gold badge stepped out of the lead car. He looked at the burning store, then at the Vances. "Are you Arthur Vance?" "I am," Arthur said, "and I have a lot to tell you." As the troopers handcuffed Silas Thorne, Beatrice leaned her head on Arthur's shoulder. The sun was just beginning to peek over the edge of the valley, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. "I still don't have a kitchen." "Artie," she said softly. Arthur looked back toward the direction of their mansion. "We'll build a new one, Bea, on a foundation that's actually clean." But as the police began to lead them toward a car for safety, Arthur saw something that made his heart stop. Standing across the road, in the shadows of the trees, were the people from the old neighborhood. Dozens of them. The woman with the baker's photo. An old man in a veteran's cap. They were standing in silence, watching. They weren't there for the Vances. They were there for the truth. And as Arthur watched, the woman with the photo raised a hand in a silent salute. The battle for the Thorne estate had just begun. But it didn't bring the warmth Arthur had expected. Instead, the light was cold and gray, revealing the true exhaustion etched into his and Beatrice's faces. They were sitting in the back of a state trooper's vehicle, wrapped in thick wool blankets that smelled of laundry detergent and old upholstery. Through the window, Arthur watched as the local gas station was transformed into a hive of activity. Forensic teams in white suits were carefully sifting through the charred remains of the deep fryer, trying to salvage any scrap of the ledger Arthur had thrown into the oil. "You did what you had to do." "Artie," Beatrice said, her voice a dry rasp. She was holding a paper cup of black coffee that had gone cold, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were fixed on the black sedan being towed away. "If you hadn't burned it, that man would have taken it, and those names would have stayed in the dark forever." Arthur leaned his head back against the seat. "I know, Bea, but a lot of people were counting on those records. Now all we have is what's up here," he said, tapping his temple. "And memories are slippery things, especially when you're as tired as I am." The state trooper, a woman with a kind face named Officer Vance, strangely enough, the same last name, opened the door. "The local department has been temporarily suspended pending a federal investigation. It's not safe for you at the mansion, and it's certainly not safe for you in your old apartment." "We aren't hiding," Arthur said, his voice regaining some of its steel. "We bought that house. We paid for it with our life savings. We have a right to stand on our own porch." "And you will, Mr. Vance," the officer replied. "But right now, you're the most important witnesses in the state. Silas Thorne is in custody, but he has lawyers who have been waiting for a day like this for decades. They're already claiming you're just confused that the ledger was a forgery, that you're trying to extort a wealthy family." The drive to the hotel was long and quiet. Arthur watched the familiar landmarks of the county pass by, but everything looked different now. Every bank branch, every new housing development, every municipal building looked like a monument built on a lie. He thought about the suitcases in the cellar. He thought about the baker who never came home. When they arrived at the hotel, it was a modest place, but it felt like a fortress. There were guards at the doors and cameras in the hallways. For the next 3 days, Arthur and Beatrice didn't rest. Instead, they were visited by a stream of people, First came the investigators. They brought tape recorders and yellow legal pads. Arthur spent hours closing his eyes, visualizing the pages of the ledger before he had tossed it into the oil. He recited names, dates, and numbers. He described the liquidated stamps. He told them about the secret room with the monitors. Beatrice helped. Her memory for the old neighborhood being sharper than any filing system, she remembered who lived in which house, who had a daughter with a piano, and who had a son who wanted to be a doctor. Together, they reconstructed a ghost map of a stolen community. Then came the families. The state troopers allowed a small group of people to meet the Vances in the hotel conference room. They were the children and grandchildren of the people listed in the ledger. There was a woman in her 70s who walked with a cane. She sat across from Arthur and took his hands in hers. "My mother was the one with the piano," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "They told us she sold it to pay for her debts before she moved us away in the middle of the night. We lived in a basement for 5 years because of those debts." "You found her name, didn't you?" Arthur nodded. "I saw it. There was a note next to it. It said asset seizure. Your mother didn't know a dime, ma'am. They just wanted the land your house sat on for the new highway." The room was filled with stories like that. But while the emotional victory was growing, the legal battle was turning ugly. On the 4th day, a man in a very expensive suit arrived at the hotel. He didn't work for the police. He was a process server. He handed Arthur a stack of papers. "You're being sued, Mr. Vance," the man said, not unkindly. "The Thorne estate is claiming that the auction was invalid due to a clerical error. They're also suing you for the destruction of private property the ledger owned, for defamation. They're asking for $3 million in damages." Arthur looked at the papers. He didn't have $3 million. He barely had $300 in his checking account after buying the house. "They want to bury us in paper," Beatrice said, reading over his shoulder. "If they can't scare us with the dark, they'll scare us with the law." "Let them try," Arthur said. That afternoon, Arthur made a decision. He asked the state troopers for a favor. He didn't want a lawyer yet. He wanted a microphone. They arranged a press conference on the steps of the courthouse, right in the center of the town. The Thorne family tried to get an injunction to stop it, but the story had already gone viral. "The couple who found the stolen city" was the headline in every paper from the coast to the mountains. When Arthur and Beatrice stepped out onto the courthouse steps, there were hundreds of people waiting. Some were holding signs. The local police were nowhere to be seen, replaced by a massive presence of state troopers and federal agents. Arthur stood at the podium. He didn't have a prepared speech. He just looked out at the crowd, seeing the faces of people who had been told for 50 years that they were crazy or lazy or unlucky. "My name is Arthur Vance," he began, his voice echoing off the stone pillars. "My wife Beatrice and I wanted a quiet place to grow old. We bought a house that nobody wanted. But when we opened the doors, we found more than just dust and rot. We found your lives. We found your parents' lives." He paused, looking directly into the cameras of the news crews. "Silas Thorne says I destroyed his property. He's right. I burned a book of lies. But the truth isn't on paper. It's in the fact that this town was built on the backs of people who were never given a fair shake. They want to sue me for $3 million? They need to pay back the bakers, the teachers, and the laborers who they robbed in the dark." The crowd erupted. It wasn't a cheer. It was a roar of 50 years of repressed anger turning into hope. In the days that followed, the tide began to turn. A young lawyer, the grandson of one of the families Arthur had named, offered to represent the Vances for free. He filed a countersuit that was so massive, it made the Thorne lawsuit look like a parking ticket. He used the suitcases in the cellar as physical evidence of a criminal enterprise, arguing that the statute of limitations didn't apply because the crimes had been actively concealed through blackmail and corruption. But the most dangerous moment came a week later. Arthur and Beatrice were finally allowed to return to the mansion, escorted by a 24-hour security detail. The house looked different now. It didn't look like a monster anymore. It looked like a patient waiting for a doctor. As they walked through the front door, Arthur noticed something. A small white envelope had been slid under the door. It wasn't a legal document. It was a handwritten note on plain paper. The ledger wasn't the only one. Check the chimney in the master bedroom. The soot isn't just wood ash. Arthur grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs, his heart pounding. The master bedroom was a cavernous room with a fireplace made of dark green marble. He knelt down and looked up into the flue. He reached his hand into a narrow gap behind the damper. His fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. He pulled it out. It was a small, high-tech hard drive wrapped in plastic. This was the maintenance Arthur had seen on the monitors. It was the digital backup of the blackmail files Silas Thorne had been using to keep the towns. Modern leaders under his thumb. "Artie, what is it?" Beatrice asked from the doorway. "It's the key," Arthur said, holding the drive up. "The ledger was the past. This is the present. This is how we make sure they can't sue us, and they can't hide anymore." As he held the drive, he heard a sound outside. It wasn't a car. It was the sound of tools. He walked to the window and looked down. Dozens of people from the town were in the yard. They weren't there to protest or to gawk. They had lawnmowers, hammers, and paint buckets. The woman with the baker's photo was planting marigolds. Along the front walk, they were reclaiming the house together. Arthur turned to Beatrice, tears finally pricking his eyes. "I think we can start on that kitchen now, Bea," she smiled, walking over to him and taking the hard drive. "First, we give this to the troopers. Then, we pick out the wallpaper." Part 4 ends with the community coming together, the discovery of the digital evidence, and the Vances finally beginning to see the mansion not as a burden, but as a home. The morning light that spilled into the master bedroom of the Thorne estate felt different than it had a week ago. It was no longer a cold, invasive light that exposed the rot. It was a warm, golden glow that seemed to bless the dust motes dancing in the air. Arthur sat on the edge of the mattress, his old bones aching from a week of depositions and hard labor. But his spirit felt lighter than it had in decades. He looked at the small digital drive sitting on the nightstand. To the world, it was a piece of plastic and silicon. To him, it was the final nail in the coffin of a dynasty that squeezed the life out of this valley for 3 generations. Beatrice walked in, carrying 2 mugs of coffee that actually smelled like coffee, not the bitter, burnt water from the hotel. She had spent the morning downstairs with the cleaning brigade, a group of 10 local women who had shown up at 6 in the morning with mops, buckets, and a fierce determination to scrub the hate out of the walls. "The state troopers are at the gate." "Artie," she said, handing him a mug. "They've got a federal prosecutor with them this time. A woman from the city. She looks like she hasn't slept in a month, but she has a smile that says she's about to win a very big prize." Arthur took a sip of the coffee and stood up. "Then let's not keep her waiting. This house has held on to its secrets long enough." They walked down the grand staircase together. The banister, once coated in decades of grime, was now gleaming. The community had polished the wood until it shone like a dark mirror. As they reached the foyer, Arthur saw the woman Beatrice had mentioned. She was standing by the fireplace, looking up at the spot where a portrait of the original Thorne patriarch had once hung. Arthur had taken that painting down on the first day and put it in the shed. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance," the prosecutor said, extending her hand. "I'm Helena Vance, no relation, though I'd be proud to claim it. I wanted to tell you in person because of you. The city council has been placed under emergency receivership. For judges have stepped down and Silas Thorne's lawyers have stopped talking about lawsuits. They're too busy trying to figure out how to keep him out of a maximum security prison." Arthur felt a wave of relief so strong he had to steady himself against the doorframe. "And the families? The ones in the ledger?" Helena's expression softened. "The state is setting up a restorative justice fund, using the Thorne family's seized assets, which are substantial. Aspooch, we are going to track down every living descendant of the families listed in those files. It won't bring back the years they lost, but it will give them back their dignity. And their land, where we can. The news hit Arthur like a physical weight, but a pleasant one. He looked out the front door. The yard was no longer a wilderness. The briars had been cleared, and the lawn was neatly trimmed. People were still there, milling about, talking in low, respectful tones. It wasn't a party. It was a gathering of witnesses. "There's one more thing," Helena said. "The county wants to buy the house back from you. They want to turn it into a museum and a center for civil rights history. They're offering a price that would let you and Mrs. Vance live anywhere in the world you want." Beatrice looked at Arthur. Arthur looked at the walls. He thought about the small apartment in the city, the wheezing radiator, and the feeling of being invisible. Then he thought about the woman with the baker's photo, the veteran on the ladder, and the way the sun hit the porch in the afternoon. "Tell the county thank you," Arthur said, his voice firm. "But the house isn't for sale. Not to them anyway." The prosecutor looked surprised. "You want to keep it? After everything that's happened here?" "We want to live here," Beatrice added, stepping up beside Arthur. "But we aren't keeping it for ourselves. We've already talked about it. We're going to turn the first floor and the cellar into a community archive. People can come here and find their history whenever they want. But the second floor? That's where Arthur is going to have his library, and I'm going to have my sewing room. This house was built on stolen labor and stolen dreams. It's time it was used to house some real ones." The prosecutor smiled, a genuine wide smile. "I think that's the best ending this story could have." After the officials left, the Vances walked out onto the porch. The crowd noticed them, and a silence fell over the lawn. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers, but the comfortable silence of neighbors. The old man in the veteran's cap walked up to the steps. "Mr. Vance," he said, tipping his hat, "the roof is patched. It'll hold through the winter. And the boys from the hardware store brought over a new furnace. They said it's on the house. Literally." Arthur laughed, a deep, belly-shaking sound he hadn't made in years. "Thank you, Henry, but I'm not sure I can accept all this charity." "It ain't charity," Henry said. "It's back pay. We've owed this town a cleaning for 50 years. You just happened to be the ones who brought the soap." The rest of the day was spent in a blur of activity. A local restaurant brought over trays of food. Children played in the yard where shadows used to loom. As the sun began to set, the crowd thinned out, leaving Arthur and Beatrice alone on their porch. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and the promise of snow. They sat in 2 rocking chairs that had been donated by the church. For a long time, they didn't say anything. They just watched the stars begin to poke through the purple sky. "Artie," Beatrice said quietly. "Yeah, B. Do you remember what you said at the auction? That you wanted a porch where the air didn't taste like exhaust?" Arthur nodded, reaching out to take her hand. His skin was rough, and hers was soft, but they fit together perfectly. "The air tastes like hope tonight," she said. Arthur looked back at the house. The windows were no longer hollow eyes. They were glowing with warm light. The abandoned mansion was gone. In its place stood a home not just for them, but for the memory of everyone who had been forgotten. They had bought it for almost nothing. But as Arthur watched his wife smile in the moonlight, he knew they had ended up with everything. The police had responded to what they found in the house. But the community had responded to what they found in the Vances. Justice had finally come to the valley, not with a bang or a gavel, but with a couple who refused to let the dark have the last word. "Let's go inside, B," Arthur said, standing up. "We've got a lot of work to do tomorrow." "Sure do, Arthur. We sure do." They walked through the front door, and as it clicked shut, the Thorne estate finally fell silent, not the silence of a grave, but the peaceful quiet of a house that was finally truly at rest.